So today I actually saw the news of yet another example of really how the myth of race perpetuates racism. And a report was just released from Stellenbosch University that suggests that colored women in South Africa have an increased risk of low cognitive function due to lower education and unhealthy lifestyles. So there's now a petition to retract that report. It was only based on 60 case studies, or a sample of 60 people, and is really leaning heavily into old colonial language with regards to labeling colored women in South Africa and associating cognitive function with that colonial category, that artificial category of race. So I want to just kind of speak out about this, and also really want to urge you at the end of this video to sign the petition. I will include a link that you can copy and paste into your browser to sign that petition to retract this very, very racist report, because truly racism can create the perception or the perpetuation of the idea of race itself. And it might take you a minute to think about how can racism come before race, but in the sense of bigotry and the idea or myth of white supremacy, that is really what birthed the very idea of separate human races. And once again, we do not meet the zoological requirements for separate race categories as a species. We are 99% the same. We are more similar than we are different. And this has been proven time and time again. And yet people continue to behave as if that is not the case. So I've been called crazy and worse for saying that race is a social construct. I have been called crazy for seeking to live a self-determined life and for robustly affiliating with our common African origins. But I continue to live by my convictions. I continue to live by my truth and my values, that the creation of separate races is in itself, again, an act of bigotry and racism, that I am not living a lie by claiming black as a label, because we are all scientifically part of the black human race, and we can choose our cultural affiliation where we feel the most at home. So that all being said, again, back to the topic of today, how does racial classification kind of juxtapose up against acts of racism or labels of groups of people? And today in this report that's being challenged by the petition, those terms kind of come up right against each other. So I want to go back just a little bit in history, not just South African history, which is what we're really talking about here, but also US history. And one of the reasons why I care so much about this situation in South Africa today is because it's coming out of Stellenbosch University, where my oldest son, Isaiah, attended for a semester on study abroad, and he did experience a very hostile environment at Stellenbosch University as a black student, and noticed the differences in a more welcoming environment in Cape Town versus Stellenbosch, and kind of how the climate, the cultural climate, was very specific in Stellenbosch, where again apartheid kind of was birthed out of that university. So in 2017, I actually visited Stellenbosch University to see my son when he was there. And between 1919 and 1978, in the height of apartheid, every prime minister in South Africa came out of Stellenbosch University. So again, they're very tied to the apartheid history And we all want to have hopes that that institution will reform and will become more progressive and more inclusive and more equitable in the future. But today's study, this report coming out of Stellenbosch University, is not a good sign that there is growth and evolution, much less just a basic understanding of science when it comes to the idea of race. So, South Africa's history, I discussed 1919 to 1978, the prime ministers being from Stellenbosch University. That's the 1900s. South Africa's history of apartheid is much more recent than America's longer history with racism going back to the 1500s. So in 1565, all the way in the 1500s, 454 years ago, colonialism comes to America. Along with colonialism coming to America are enslaved African people on the ships. And I choose to use the term enslaved Africans versus slaves because the slaves does not define a person. These are individuals who have been victimized by an oppressive system. So this is something that's happening to them. It's not their birth identity. It's something that is being decided by other people. So with enslaved Africans in 1565, very, very long time ago. And this is the Spanish colony of St. Augustine in Florida, actually, in 1565. So then, kind of moving just a little bit forward into 1640, a guy by the name of John Punch, and you can kind of remember the first two Johns in America, 1640 and then 1654. John, not Castor, John Casor. I was going to say Castor for some reason. So John Punch and John Casor. So John Punch, the situation with him essentially is that he was treated different. There were 3 runaway indentured servants. And again, indentured servitude is different than chattel slavery because indentured servitude meant you served a certain amount of time, like doing a prison term, and then you are free to go. And indentured servants then, of course, could move on with their life after their time, own land, and experience basic human rights and civil rights as a regular part of society. John Punch escaped with 2 white indentured servants. Now, the white indentured servants absorbed into society, but he was singled out and sentenced to life, making him really the first legally documented slave or enslaved African person in the U.S. So first legally documented, and again, this is before the U.S. actually became the U.S., obviously, but this is in the colony of Virginia. A lot of this happened in Virginia, so not super surprising, part of the South, but first legally documented as documented person as a slave. So, and then the second John Casor, completed his term of indentured servitude, but his supervisor at the time basically said, no, he didn't complete it. Actually, he was indentured for life. He owes me his life. He is going to have to serve me for life. And the Virginia courts ruled on the side of the so-called master. And so he was, again, legally defined as a slave. So the two jobs. So we haven't even got to the 1700s, let alone the 1900s, which is what we're talking about when we deal with apartheid. Now, one of the most significant things is in 1662, again in Virginia, when matriarchal heritage or lineage becomes institutionalized. And this actually carries forward into the U.S. Once the U.S. is made an independent country, this is kind of a de facto perpetuation. So this means that the mother of a child passes on automatically her social status. So under the race worldview, nominally black mothers in the U.S. at this time would be passing on the social status of an enslaved status to their children. And that means that nominally white fathers would not be passing on their social status to children who are birthed from a black mother. Okay, so this basically institutionalizes slavery in the United States as something much different than indentured servitude or any other type of slavery around the world. This is matriarchal heritage, meaning that if you are born to a black woman, you are classified as a slave regardless of the father's social status or status of being free or enslaved. So that is, again, the 1600s. And then in the 1700s, my chalk just broke. 1705 is when slave codes in Virginia, good old Virginia, so people who, these slave codes are institutionalized, meaning that what was defined in Virginia as a person who would automatically be enslaved were anyone coming to this colony from a country where they were not a Christian. So this is when Christianity really gets attached to the idea of difference with regards to so-called race. So this is long before Immanuel Kant issues his the Racine articles, which claim this medical, scientific, or anthropological difference of he tries to prove or claim that darker skinned people are less intellectually capable than lighter skinned human beings. So that's in 1785. So even before that, this idea of inferior social status and the institutionalization of oppression based on what are deemed visible or racialized human differences when it comes to Europeans and Africans is instituted in the United States, or pre-United States, aka Florida, Virginia, and so on. So the slave codes, again, deeming that anybody who does not come from a country where they were Christian or from a Christian country is going to be legally enslaved, and or also this included American Indians or Native Americans who were sold to the colonists or captured and given or whatever. So slave codes also did apply in 1705 to people of native descent in North America who were able to be oppressed in a situation by the colonists. So that was, again, 1705, a long time ago, but still very relevant today to how we came about understanding race as a worldview. Sorry about that. I just had to go ahead and find something to clean my chalkboard off with. So 1705, again, is where we're leaving off with slave codes of Virginia. Just to jump forward from there to also in the 1700s again, but 80 years later, 1785 is when Immanuel Kant basically comes up with this or presents this idea in his Racine articles. That darker skinned humans are socially inferior to lighter skinned humans. Now, in that in the 1705 slave codes in Virginia that actually deemed at anyone coming into the colony who was not of Christian origin would be considered legally enslaved, that was attached to the idea of the curse of Ham in the Bible, whereby Europeans assumed that because Ham moved to the south, that meant Africa, that meant that Ham was the father of all black people, that meant that by this very twisted logic, that all black people were cursed as servants of everybody else, essentially, because it says in the Bible that, servant of servants shall he be, and his children and so on. But that particular myth or that logic of the curse of Ham was attached to those slave codes in 1705. Okay, so that's a religious influence, again, toward the, fueling the white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist, imperialist regime. So in 1785, Kant's Racine articles then are going to try to prove, he suggests and tries to, suggest that there's proof that lighter skinned human beings are superior, again, underscoring that idea of white supremacy. Then in 1815, Sarah Bartman dies, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her South African name correctly. So, some people call her Sarah Bartman just to make it a little bit easier on the pronunciation. But so she was considered Venus Hottentot. She was paraded around before her death as an example of physical difference of black women. And she was then dissected by, in a very, an even further act of disrespect in her death that was juxtaposed to the very humiliating and oppressive life that she lived at the hands of the colonists. So she was dissected by Georges Cuvier, who actually concluded by his dissection that her vagina, her genitals were not different from European women. They were not more similar to monkeys than humans, etc. but he decided that her buttocks was more similar to that of a baboon than of a European woman, and that her skull was more similar to a monkey's skull than a human skull. Therefore, confirming in terms of this myth, underscoring really the insanity of white supremacy, suggesting that lighter skinned humans are more intellectual, which came from the skull, and also suggesting an additional stereotype or underpinning of dehumanization, which was to suggest that there's a racial difference in women based on the size of their derriere. So, which interestingly it's continued, as we all know, to this day. And even in just isolated cases, people are constantly racializing people's behind. And that is a very dehumanizing process. I've even had a lot of people arguing over whether I'm black or white based on, my butt. Is my butt more black or white? And if it looks more black, then she must have some black ancestor somewhere, as opposed to noticing that we are all 99% the same, and literally there are all sorts of body shapes and types across human history, and we all go back to a black woman eventually anyway in Africa. So, butt size does not necessarily prove or disprove your so-called race, nor does intellect, because we know that there are many, many geniuses, inventors, child prodigies, on and on, that are darker than we could compare those people to in some kind of limited case study. Lighter skinned individuals who have a lower IQ than they do, and then come up with some kind of concocted reality that would be the opposite of this. So a lot of times these so-called studies, such as Cuvier and Kant, really start with the conclusion they want, and then they seek to find the information that will support that conclusion, similar to this article today that suggests that colored South African women have an increased risk of low cognitive function due to lower education and unhealthy lifestyle in this small sample of 60 people. Out of 60 people, how can you say anything conclusive? So these very unscientific studies that are kind of wonky, that really have lasting, centuries long consequences with regards to initiating that idea of racial difference, and we continue to behave as if this is fact, as opposed to paying attention to the actual science, which says, no, there is no factual evidence. In fact, scientifically, we do not meet, again, the zoological requirements for separate races. So there is no way that these things can be true. Now, so that's in 1815. This is, again, South African history. Then out of the 1800s comes, I think it was 1913, was the Natives Land Act, where segregation of land was based on so-called race. So Natives Land Act that's 1913. Then in 1948, the government policy of apartheid is adopted formally, and laws are passed to classify the population by race. And in the case of South Africa, Afrikaans, or white, colored, were in between. Xhosa were black, and there was this ladder of privilege based on those classifications. So this is 1948, and by 1994, then the apartheid formally ended, but as we know, that did not end racism any more than right in here, the Emancipation Proclamation happens in the U.S. 1863 to 1865, from proclamation to actually formally making that transition to citizenship. So right after Sarah Baartman's death, about 50 years later, in the United States, finally citizenship is granted across the country after the Civil War. And following this, in South Africa, well, we should also mention that diamonds were discovered in Kimberley, so there's a huge explosion of discovered resources that then kind of drive motivation, again, that link between white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism, trying to reinstitutionalize colonialism essentially in South Africa in 1948, and that ends in 1994. And now in 2019, here we are with the idea that colored women in South Africa, with this report, I'm going to, using their language, the language of the report, are likely, or it suggests that they have an increased risk for lower cognitive function. So, I just wanted to read one quote by Shahid Muhammad about today's news, and he was a lecturer at University of Cape Town. He said, the origin of the current world population is African, if you want to really be a stickler for being precise. I think that the professor, Terblanche, I think is how you pronounce the professor's name that came out with this report that was announced or contested today. I think the professor is confusing an artificial colonial term which was used as a means to artificially separate people. Many people who were colored were classified as white, and many people who were white were classified as colored. These are not scientific categories, they are contested colonial terms. And so that, again, really driving at the fact that, in 2019, how far have we come from 454 years ago in North America? And so when people say 500 years ago with the idea of race, that is harking back to when colonists invaded African spaces in what was called the Scramble for Africa, and essentially introduced the idea that Europeans had the right to invade those spaces, to exploit land, resources, and people in the African continent, because there was, number one, not an appreciation or reverence for our common African human origins, nor was there a respect for human life in general. This was driven, colonialism was driven by ideas of white supremacy, of ideas of patriarchy, of ideas of even manifest destiny connected to, white supremacy. The ideas of white supremacy are very connected to male-dominated religion, and that's connected to capitalism and greed with resources, land, etc. And then that is wrapped up in this big imperialist machine whereby 90% of the continent of Africa was claimed as belonging to Europe within a very short period of time. And those colonies then exploited not just the land and the resources, but also the people, churning out the transatlantic slave trade and many more very devastating behaviors that still have an impact today in independent African countries, as well as in the United States of America, as well as with people living in European countries who interact on the basis of so-called race. And today in South Africa, again, coming out of Stellenbosch University with no huge surprise given the history of that institution. Again, I've been there personally, and my son attended there for a semester. And, with regards to Confederate monuments coming down in America, I hope that someday the Apartheid monuments that are even on campus at Stellenbosch University are brought down, because those reminders really inflict more pain in a wound that yet has to be healed when it comes to this artificial idea of separate races and value and worth being ascribed to those different groups of people, including questioning intellect or ability and much more. So I hope that you are able to copy and paste the link. If it doesn't appear live, I will put it on the description of this video so that you can sign that petition for the University of Stellenbosch to redact this report, this very unscientific report that puts salt in the already still painful wound of racism in South Africa and around the world for the last 500 or so years. Also, I would urge that with this petition, not only is that report redacted, but an apology should be issued, and there should be some kind of demonstrable evidence made that Stellenbosch University is in fact going to seek more equitable and inclusive scientific exploration, as well as just academic thought. So I hope that you're able to participate in signing the petition today, and also hope you learned a couple things if you didn't already know all of this history, which I'm sure some people do know, but it doesn't hurt to be reminded of it. And if you didn't know, then now you know.